My sister Danielle looked straight at 200 guests at her rehearsal dinner and said something about me that made the entire table laugh. She smiled like it was harmless and said, "This is my sister Naomi. She is just a nurse. Not a doctor, not a specialist, just a nurse. The kind of job people politely respect until they decide it is not impressive enough for a room full of investors and developers." My father heard it and laughed too, the quiet kind that tells you he agreed with the joke. I stood there in a simple navy dress after a 12-hour trauma shift in Houston and did what I had done most of my life around my family. I swallowed it and stayed quiet, because correcting Danielle in front of her wedding guests would only make things worse. What nobody in that room realized was that 3 years earlier, on a storm-soaked stretch of Interstate 10 outside Houston, a black SUV had rolled onto its side, and the man trapped inside would not have survived the night if someone had not crawled into the wreckage and kept him conscious until the ambulance arrived. I never told anyone my name that night. I just drove back to the hospital and finished my shift. But as my sister stood there smiling at the crowd, the man who had been in that crash was already standing among the guests, watching me with a look that said he was starting to remember exactly where he had heard my voice before. My name is Naomi Whitaker. I am 34 years old. I am an ER trauma nurse in Houston. And this is the night my sister learned that sometimes the person you call just a nurse is the only reason someone in that room is still alive. Naomi Whitaker arrived at Lake Conroe Resort just as the last of the evening lights settled across the water. The place looked like something out of a magazine: wide lawns, white lanterns hanging from oak trees, a line of black SUVs parked along the drive, while valets moved like quiet shadows between them. Tonight was the rehearsal dinner for my sister Danielle's wedding. The Avery family had reserved half the resort: oil executives, developers, attorneys, people who wore linen jackets even after the sun went down. The kind of crowd that shook hands while quietly evaluating each other's net worth. I stepped out of my car and smoothed the sleeves of my navy dress. It was simple and comfortable, the sort of thing you could still breathe in after a 12-hour hospital shift. As I walked toward the reception patio, I felt the familiar sensation settle in my chest. At family events like this, I always felt like someone who had wandered in from the wrong door. A hostess stood beside a long wooden table near the entrance. Place cards were arranged in neat rows. She smiled politely when I approached. "Name?" "Naomi Whitaker." Her finger moved down the list, then she picked up a card and handed it to me. The card read, "Natalie Whitaker." For a moment, I simply looked at it. "Is that correct?" The hostess glanced at the list again. "That's what we were given by the bride." I nodded. "That's fine." I slipped the card into my clutch and walked toward the lawn. A string quartet was playing something soft near the water. Servers moved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Most of the guests were already in small circles of conversation. Laughter traveled easily across the patio. Danielle stood near the center of it all, exactly where she liked to be. My sister had always been good at rooms like this. She wore a pale gold dress that caught the lantern light every time she moved. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek knot that probably took an hour to perfect. Danielle Whitaker, 38 years old, luxury event strategist. She built weddings for people who owned private jets. Tonight, she looked less like a bride and more like the director of the entire evening. Michael Avery stood beside her, speaking with a group of investors. Tall, confident, the kind of man who seemed to belong naturally in expensive places. Michael was 41 and ran Avery Development Partners. His family built residential communities all over Texas. A marriage between Danielle Whitaker and Michael Avery was exactly the kind of alliance both families understood. My father stood nearby with Caroline. Thomas Whitaker was 64 and still ran Whitaker Auto Group across Houston. Caroline had married him when I was 16 and spent the last 2 decades building a reputation as a charity powerhouse in the city. She was already talking about the hospital fundraiser scheduled for the fall. I moved toward the bar before anyone noticed me standing alone. A bartender handed me sparkling water. "You part of the wedding party?" "Just family." He smiled in that neutral way people use when they are not sure how important you are. I turned and nearly walked into a group of Danielle's friends. One of the women recognized my last name. "You're Danielle's sister, right?" "That's me." "What do you do in Houston?" "I'm a trauma nurse, ER at Memorial Hermann." There was a short pause. Danielle appeared beside us with the timing of someone who had been watching the conversation from across the patio. She slipped an arm lightly around the woman's shoulder. Her smile was bright and controlled. "She works in emergency." Another guest leaned forward. "That must be intense." Danielle gave a soft laugh. "Oh, it is." Then she waved a hand casually. "She's just a nurse." A few polite cluckers moved through the group. Not cruel, not loud, just enough to let the moment pass without discomfort. I looked across the lawn. My father had heard it. He lifted his glass and smiled at someone else, as if nothing unusual had happened. That part always landed the hardest. Not the words, the silence. I took a sip of my drink and let the conversation drift away without correcting anything. A few minutes later, the crowd shifted as more guests arrived. That was when I noticed the older man watching me. He stood near the edge of the patio, with one hand resting on the back of a chair. Tall, even in his 70s, gray hair cut short, a calm presence that made people give him space without realizing it. Richard Callahan. Even if someone didn't know the face, the name traveled easily in Houston. He had built Callahan Shipping Group decades earlier and sold it for more money than most people ever saw in their lives. Now, he and his wife Eleanor ran the Callahan Medical Foundation. I had seen him at a few hospital charity events over the years. His eyes stayed on me for a moment longer before he walked over. "You said you work emergency?" His voice was steady and low. "Yes." "How long?" "Almost 10 years. He nodded slowly, studying my face in a way that made me slightly uncomfortable. "You must see a lot of difficult nights." "Some." A server passed carrying a tray of drinks and clipped the corner of a chair. One of the older guests sitting nearby startled and pressed his hand against his chest. I stepped toward him automatically. "It's all right." I crouched slightly so he could see my face. "Look at me." His breathing was fast but steady. "Stay with me." The man nodded after a moment and waved off the attention once the initial scare passed. When I stood again, Richard Callahan was still looking at me. Not politely, not casually, like someone who had just heard something familiar but couldn't yet place it. "You handle that well. It's part of the job." He held my gaze another second before giving a small nod. Around us, the music continued, and the conversations picked back up. But as I walked toward the water, I could still feel his attention following me across the lawn. I looked away from the water and told myself I was imagining it. At weddings, people watched each other all the time. That was half the point of events like this. People comparing dresses, careers, houses, the subtle scoreboard everyone pretended not to keep. Still, the look from Richard Callahan lingered in my mind longer than I expected. I finished my drink and stepped off the lawn toward the gravel path that led around the lake. The music from the quartet softened behind me. When I work long hospital shifts, silence feels like oxygen. That night reminded me of a different kind of noise. The emergency department at Memorial Hermann never gets quiet. I I started working there in the summer of 2015 through the hospital's nursing residency program. I was 25 years old, 2 months out of nursing school, and convinced I could handle anything the threw at me. It took about 3 weeks to learn humility. Memorial sits in the Texas Medical Center, the largest medical complex in the country. Ambulances roll through the bay doors day and night. Some nights it's chest pain and broken wrists. Other nights it's chaos. One Tuesday evening last winter, the radio call came in before the ambulance even reached the ramp. Multi-vehicle collision on Highway 59, 2 incoming. The trauma doors flew open, and the paramedics pushed a stretcher straight toward us. The patient was young, mid-20s maybe, blood soaking through a torn t-shirt. Olivia Torres was already pulling gloves on beside me. Olivia had been in the almost as long as I had. Pressure's dropping. She handed me a saline line while the trauma team moved around the bed. Dr. Kevin Matsuda stepped in from the next room. He ran the emergency department with the calm focus of someone who had seen everything before. "What do we have?" "High-speed collision." Olivia pointed to the monitor. "BP 80/40. Dr. Matsuda moved to the head of the bed. "Naomi, 2 large-bore lines." I slid the needle into the patient's arm and taped the IV in place. The room filled with motion, monitors beeping, nurses calling out vitals, someone wheeling in a portable ultrasound. The patient tried to move. His eyes were wide with fear. I leaned closer so he could see my face. "Look at me." His breathing was shallow. "Stay with me." He focused on my voice while the rest of the team worked. A few minutes later, the trauma surgeon arrived and the patient was rushed upstairs to the operating room. When the doors closed behind the gurney, the went quiet again for about 30 seconds. Olivia leaned against the counter and exhaled. "Every time I think this place can't get crazier." I peeled off my gloves and dropped them in the bin. "You say that every shift." She smiled. "That's because you keep the place from exploding." I rinsed my hands at the sink. "You give me too much credit." Olivia shook her head. "No." She pointed toward the trauma room. "When everyone else starts spinning, you're the one who slows it down." Dr. Matsuda passed behind us carrying a chart. "She's right." He didn't stop walking. "That's why I keep putting Naomi on the trauma team." Moments like that were normal for me. At the hospital, people trusted my judgment. When things got chaotic, they looked to me to steady the room. But outside the hospital, those same qualities barely existed, especially around my family. My father married Caroline in 2007, the year I turned 17. Danielle was already part of the package. She was 20 at the time, confident, polished, the kind of person who could talk comfortably to anyone in a room. Caroline adored her. My father admired her ambition. Within a year, Danielle had become the center of every conversation at home. When she launched her event planning company, Caroline told everyone she met that her daughter was building something extraordinary. When I finished nursing school and accepted my position in 2015, the reaction was polite but brief. "You'll be good at that." That was about it. The pattern stayed the same for years. My birthday dinners quietly postponed, family holidays built around Danielle's schedule. When people asked my father about his children, Danielle's achievements came first. I learned early that arguing about it only made things worse. Silence was easier. A few years ago, I heard a story about myself that I didn't recognize. Danielle had told several friends that I could be difficult, emotionally unpredictable, too intense. Those words traveled farther than I expected. By the time Michael Avery entered the picture, that version of me had already been introduced. I didn't know exactly what he believed, but I had a sense of the outline. The rain started again outside my car. That memory always arrives with the same sound. October of 2022. I had just finished a night shift at Memorial Hermann and was driving west on Interstate 10 before sunrise. The storm had rolled in fast. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. A few miles ahead of me, traffic slowed abruptly. Headlights scattered across the highway. I saw the SUV on its side near the shoulder. Steam curled from the hood. I pulled over without thinking. The driver's door was crushed, but the passenger side was open enough to reach inside. An older man was trapped halfway across the seats. His breathing came in sharp bursts. "Can you hear me?" His eyes moved toward my voice. I braced my foot against the frame and pulled until he slid free onto the wet pavement. The rain soaked both of us in seconds. He grabbed my sleeve. His voice shook. "Am I dying?" I crouched beside him and steadied his shoulders. "No." I held his gaze. "Stay with me." The sirens arrived a few minutes later, red lights reflecting off the highway. The EMTs took over and moved him onto a stretcher. One of them looked at me. "You family?" "No." "What are you?" "I'm a nurse." They nodded and turned back to the patient. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. If I didn't get back soon, the morning shift would be short-staffed, so I drove away. A few months later, someone in the hospital mentioned that the EMS report had flagged the incident. Someone had submitted a note of appreciation internally. It stayed inside the system. That was enough for me. The music from the rehearsal dinner drifted back across the lake as I returned to the patio. Lanterns glowed against the dark water. Guests moved between tables, laughing, raising glasses, celebrating a wedding that hadn't even happened yet. Across the lawn, I spotted Richard Callahan again. He stood beside the bar, speaking quietly with another guest. Then he glanced in my direction, just for a second, like he was still trying to place something he couldn't quite reach. I told myself it was nothing and stepped back into the light. The lights from the patio followed me as I stepped back onto the lawn. By the time the rehearsal dinner ended, the air around Lake Conroe had turned warm and quiet. People drifted toward the resort buildings in loose groups, laughing softly as the staff began clearing tables. I watched the last of the lanterns dim over the water before heading inside. The wedding was scheduled for the next afternoon. By noon the next day, the entire resort looked different. White chairs stretched across the lawn in neat rows, facing the lake. Floral arrangements lined the aisle. A string quartet warmed up under a canopy, while guests began arriving in waves of polished shoes and pastel suits. More than 200 people had been invited. I arrived early, mostly to avoid walking in with a crowd. Inside the reception hall, staff moved quickly between tables, placing name cards beside folded menus. I scanned the seating chart mounted near the entrance. Family tables were closest to the dance floor. Whitaker and Avery names filled most of them. My name appeared near the bottom of the board, table 16, near the service corridor. I walked over to the table just to confirm it. From there, you could see the kitchen doors swinging open and closed, while servers carried trays in and out. Caroline appeared behind me. Her perfume reached me before her voice did. "That seat should be comfortable." I looked at the table again. "It's near the kitchen." She smiled in that composed way she used at charity events. "It's quieter there." I nodded. "Of course." She squeezed my arm briefly before turning to greet another arriving guest. By the time the ceremony started, the lawn was full. The sun hung low above the lake when Danielle walked down the aisle on my father's arm. From where I stood near the back, she looked exactly the way she always had during big moments. Calm, certain, the center of the room. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. Applause rolled across the lawn when they kissed, and guests began moving toward the ballroom for the reception. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly against the Texas heat. Table 16 was exactly where I expected. I set my clutch on the chair and watched servers line glasses along the tables. Michael Avery appeared beside me a few minutes later. He looked slightly uncomfortable standing near the kitchen doors. "I've been meaning to talk to you." I turned toward him. "About what?" He hesitated for a second. "Danielle mentioned you've had some difficult periods." He chose the words carefully. "Emotionally." I studied his face. There was no accusation in his tone, just uncertainty. The kind people carry when they've been told something but aren't sure whether they believe it. "That's interesting." He shifted slightly. "She said you can be intense sometimes." I glanced across the room. Danielle was laughing with a group of guests near the bar. "I work in an emergency room." Michael nodded slowly. "I guess that would do it." Before the conversation could continue, Danielle walked over. Her smile stayed fixed as she looked between us. "I see you've met my sister." Michael gestured lightly. "We were talking." Danielle's eyes moved to me. "Naomi always throws herself into things." She gave a small laugh. "She can be a little intense." A couple seated at the nearby table overheard and chuckled politely. Michael looked uncertain again. I simply picked up the water glass in front of me. Across the room, my father stood with several Avery relatives. He had a clear view of the conversation. He turned slightly and continued speaking to the man beside him. The band began playing soft jazz near the dance floor. Guests filled their seats while waiters poured wine. I sat through the first course mostly in silence. The conversation around the table drifted from property taxes to summer travel plans. No one asked me another question. After the plates were cleared, I stood and walked toward the bar. The ballroom had grown louder as more people gathered near the dance floor. Richard Callahan stood at the far end of the bar, speaking quietly with the bartender. He noticed me approaching and stepped aside. "You made it through the ceremony." I smiled faintly. That was the easy part. He studied my face again, the same thoughtful expression from the night before. "I've been meaning to ask you something." I leaned against the counter. "What is it?" He paused, as if arranging the memory in his head. "Have you ever stopped on Interstate 10 during a storm?" The question caught me off guard. "A few times." His eyes sharpened slightly. "A bad storm, late at night?" I opened my mouth to answer. Before the words came out, a loud crash echoed across the ballroom. A server had dropped a tray of champagne glasses near one of the tables. The sound shattered the room's conversation. One of the older guests at that table grabbed the edge of his chair, breathing quickly as people around him leaned closer in confusion. I moved without thinking. When I reached him, I crouched so he could see my face clearly. "Look at me." His breathing was fast and uneven. "Stay with me." His eyes locked on mine. After a moment, his shoulders relaxed and the panic eased. A staff member handed him a glass of water while I stepped back. The room slowly returned to its normal rhythm. When I turned around, Richard Callahan was staring at me. Not politely, not casually. His entire posture had gone still, like a man who had just heard the final piece of a puzzle slide into place. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The band began playing again behind us. Across the ballroom, Danielle raised her glass to start another toast, but Richard Callahan never looked away from me. The music softened and the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as servers began clearing the dessert plates. I had moved back toward table 16 after the small commotion near the bar. The older guest I helped was already laughing with the people around him again, the moment fading into the general noise of the reception. But the look on Richard Callahan's face had not faded from my mind. Across the room, Danielle stepped onto the small platform near the dance floor where the microphone waited. Conversation slowed as people turned their chairs. Danielle lifted her glass. Her voice carried easily through the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Polite applause followed. She spoke about Michael first, about their future, about how grateful she was to both families for making the night possible. The words sounded practiced, the way someone sounds when they have delivered the same speech in their head dozens of times. Then she turned toward the Whitaker tables. My father has always believed in hard work. She gestured toward Thomas Whitaker. And Caroline has shown me what it means to build something meaningful in this community. More applause. I watched quietly from the edge of the room. Danielle paused for a moment, as if deciding how to finish. Her eyes moved across the tables and eventually settled on me. The smile she gave was gentle enough that someone watching casually might have missed the edge beneath it. Family is a funny thing. A few people laughed softly. Some of us grow up learning how to build things. She glanced toward Michael and the Avery relatives. And some people, her voice slowed slightly, some people in life should learn their place. The words hung in the air. Danielle tilted her head just enough for the room to understand who she meant. Then she added one more sentence. She should have stayed invisible. For a moment, the ballroom fell completely still. It was not loud cruelty. It was quieter than that. The kind of remark that gives everyone in the room permission to look away. I felt dozens of eyes shift and then quickly move somewhere else. My father stood near the Avery table, holding his glass. He did not move. He did not say anything. Danielle lowered the microphone slightly and took a sip of champagne as if the speech had reached its natural end. That was when a chair scraped across the floor near the bar. Richard Callahan stood. He was tall enough that the movement caught attention immediately. He walked slowly toward the center of the room while the music from the band faded into silence. When he reached the front of the ballroom, he looked toward Danielle. "May I ask her something?" His voice was calm but carried clearly. Danielle blinked once, caught off guard by the interruption. The microphone was still in her hand. Richard turned slightly and looked across the room. His gaze found me again. "Were you driving on Interstate 10 during a storm 3 years ago?" The question landed in the quiet room like a stone dropping into water. My mind moved backward before I could stop it. Rain hitting the windshield, the overturned SUV on the shoulder, the sound of sirens cutting through the dark. Richard continued speaking, his eyes still on mine. My vehicle rolled onto its side. A few guests shifted in their chairs. I remember someone pulling the door open. He lifted one hand slowly, as if replaying the moment. A nurse. The ballroom remained silent. Richard's voice stayed steady. She pulled me out into the rain. Images from that night came back in sharp flashes. The weight of the door, the smell of gasoline, the cold pavement beneath my knees. Richard took another step forward. I couldn't breathe. He paused. And she told me something. The room seemed to lean toward him. He looked directly at me. "Stay with me." A murmur moved across the tables. Richard nodded slightly, as if confirming the memory to himself. Those were the words. My hands rested lightly against the back of the chair in front of me. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. Richard spoke again. "I have been trying to find that nurse for 3 years. He glanced briefly toward the Avery family. Our foundation contacted several hospitals across Houston. A few heads turned in my direction, but we never had a name. Richard's eyes returned to mine. Until tonight. He pointed toward me with a calm certainty that left no room for confusion. That was you. The room did not erupt. Instead, a slow wave of recognition moved across the guests. People looked from Richard to me and then back again. Danielle lowered her glass slightly. For the first time that evening, her expression shifted. Richard turned back toward her. "And you call her only a nurse." The sentence settled over the room like a quiet verdict. Michael Avery looked toward me with a different expression than before. Not uncertainty, something closer to realization. Near the front table, an older man stood. Harold Avery, Michael's father. He walked toward me with deliberate steps, the room parting slightly as he approached. When he reached table 16, he stopped beside my chair. For a moment, he simply studied my face. Then he spoke quietly. "You were the one who stopped that night." I nodded once. The music had not resumed. The entire ballroom seemed to be waiting for the next thing to happen. For several seconds, no one moved. The music had not started again. The band members sat quietly behind their instruments, watching the same scene everyone else was watching. Harold Avery remained beside my chair. He studied my face as if comparing it to a memory he had just heard about. Across the room, Danielle still stood near the microphone. Her glass had lowered halfway to the table. People began whispering. Not loudly, just enough to shift the mood of the room. Danielle recovered first. She gave a quick laugh that sounded thinner than the one she used earlier in the evening. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." She looked toward Richard Callahan. "I'm sure Naomi helped someone once or twice. She works in a hospital." Her voice tried to regain the confident rhythm from before. "But I'm certain that's not what you think." Richard did not raise his voice. He simply looked at her. "I know exactly what I think." He turned his attention briefly toward the crowd. "I remember the rain, I remember the vehicle on its side, and I remember the nurse who pulled me out of that car." He paused long enough for the room to settle. "That nurse is Naomi Whitaker." No one laughed this time. Danielle opened her mouth as if to respond again, but stopped. Richard continued, "Without her, I would not be standing in this room tonight." The words were calm, but carried weight in the silence. Conversations around the ballroom began shifting. People looked at me differently now, not with curiosity the way they had earlier, but with something closer to respect. A woman near the Avery table leaned toward the person beside her and whispered something. Harold Avery gave a slow nod and stepped back toward his family. Before anyone else spoke, another woman moved across the floor, Eleanor Callahan. She had been seated near the front table until now. Her posture carried the same quiet authority as her husband's. When she reached us, she offered a warm smile. "You must be Naomi." "Yes." Her eyes softened. "I've heard about you for 3 years." She glanced toward Richard. "My husband never stopped talking about the nurse who helped him that night." She reached lightly for my hand. "The Callahan Medical Foundation has been expanding several training programs for emergency nurses across Texas." A few guests leaned closer to hear. "We have been looking for experienced ER professionals to help guide that work." Her voice remained gentle but confident. "I would like to speak with you about joining our advisory group." For a moment, the ballroom stayed quiet. Then someone near the back began clapping. The sound spread across the room in small waves until most of the guests were applauding. I felt heat rise in my face. Across the floor, Michael Avery approached slowly. His expression had changed from earlier in the evening, less certain, more thoughtful. He stopped beside me. I didn't know. His voice was low enough that only I could hear it. I believed what Danielle told me. I nodded once. I figured. He glanced toward his new wife, standing near the microphone. For the first time all evening, Michael seemed unsure where to look. "I'm sorry." I let the moment pass without responding. Around us, the band finally began playing again, a soft piano melody filling the space where tension had lived a few minutes earlier. Guests returned to their seats, but the atmosphere had shifted. The conversations were quieter now, more careful. Danielle stepped down from the platform and disappeared briefly behind a group of relatives. Several people who had been speaking with her earlier now seemed suddenly busy with their drinks. No one confronted her, but no one rushed to stand beside her either. That was the kind of consequence people in rooms like this understood. Later in the evening, the reception slowly returned to something resembling celebration. Dancing started. Servers brought coffee and dessert. I stepped outside onto the terrace for air. The lake was dark now, reflecting only the small lights along the shoreline. A few minutes later, the door behind me opened. My father walked out. Thomas Whitaker looked older than he had earlier that day. He stood beside me without speaking for a moment. Finally, he cleared his throat. I should have said something. The words came quietly. I should have said something years ago. I watched the water for a moment before answering. You didn't. He nodded. I know. The breeze moved gently across the lake. I thought staying neutral kept the peace. He looked down at his hands, but I see now that it didn't. I turned toward him. The silence lasted a long time. He met my eyes. I'm sorry. The apology sounded sincere, but it also sounded late. I gave a small nod. I'm not angry. That part was true, but I stopped waiting for you to fix it. He seemed to understand. For the first time that evening, neither of us tried to fill the quiet. Eventually, he returned inside to the reception. I stayed on the terrace a little longer. From where I stood, I could still hear the music drifting through the ballroom doors. Laughter rose and fell across the room, but the tone had changed. Something unspoken had shifted in the way people looked at one another. Earlier in the evening, I was the person at the table near the kitchen, the sister who should stay quiet, the one who should stay invisible. Now, those same people knew something different. Not because I had demanded it, not because I fought anyone in that room, just because the truth eventually found its way into the open. For a long time, I believed that my family deciding who I was meant more than anything else. That night showed me something different. The value of my life had never depended on their approval. Before we finish, I want to ask you something. If you had been standing in that ballroom and your own family stayed silent while someone tried to diminish you, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have walked away and built your life somewhere their voices could no longer define you?